Welcome back to another Star Mini Gaming YouTube video. As always, my name is James, and this is actually a special Tactica Tuesday episode. I wanted to do this one for a little while. The idea actually came to me several days ago. Really started putting in the research a few days ago to get this ready. Unfortunately, Paul and I were unable to do this together. Honestly, more because of my life than his, but our schedules just were in conflict. So this one time, and perhaps one time only, I'll be running Tactica Tuesday solo, but I didn't want to miss this week. I've been trying to do every other week while I can, and this is a topic that's too near and dear to my heart to not cover. So this episode will probably be a bit shorter than normal, but with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right in to this Tactica Tuesday episode on the rise of skirmishers within Age of Sigmar, especially considering the General's Handbook 2017. So let me go ahead and get this up and sharing. All right, here we go. So in Age of Sigmar, we have the rise of a unit type known as, that I'm calling the skirmishers. This is a historical reference back to ancient Rome and Greek armies, especially early Romans. They would have units that would typically go ahead of the hoplite, spear walls, or the Roman legion, basically shield block formations, and they'd have these skirmishing units engage the enemies before the main army did. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So within Age of Sigmar, there's a lot of different ways we can categorize units. We can call them elite or horde units. We can call them a hammer or an anvil. We can call them a cav or an infantry. We can call them chaff. We can call them support, or any other multitude of other names. And all these things are useful. They help define battlefield roles, and they help us to understand how to properly use these units in game. They help us kind of give an idea of the maximum strengths and weaknesses of these different kinds of units. But there's one other classification that, as I mentioned earlier, I'd like to touch on here, and that is really how they fight. We have, close combat versus melee, or I'm sorry, close combat or melee units, which my apologies, this is acting up on me. Let's hide this. There we go. There we go. Such as this mighty Paladin Retributor. We have shooting units, such as these feared Empire handgunners. Or we have the Skirmisher, which is more of a mid-range type unit like these Prosecutors. Now, these guys are a bit of a jack of all trades and a master of none, but I want to show you how, within Age of Sigmar, especially considering this new meta, that I think the role of these kind of dual phase units is going to grow to where, if your army can take them, in almost every case, it's going to be highly beneficial for you to do so. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So the role of skirmishers within your army, here's a large army here that we can kind of look at for reference. They basically operate outside of the main bulk of your army. Their main priority is to harass and weaken enemy elements prior to the battle lines closing, and throw the advantage your way. So, for example, if you're running a death rattle army and you have excuse me, you have, say, a block of 40 skeletons, and your opponent has some big nasty unit of, let's say, 30 Chaos Warriors, and those are the two most powerful units on the table, and they are inevitably marching towards each other. If you, as, say, the Death Rattle player, want to throw the advantage a little bit more in your favor, you might use a skirmishing unit to hit the opponent from a short missile range, and maybe engage them in melee as well, if you're willing to lose the unit, perhaps. To weaken that big block, that big battle line unit that your opponent has as kind of the keystone of their force before your two heavy shield walls clash, to kind of give yourself a little bit more of an advantage in that fight. Really, the big thing here with these kind of skirmishing units is they're really too dangerous to be ignored, but they're too weak to really be worth a large amount of resources being allocated to handle them properly. And they can really threaten key points on the battlefield. So you might ask, okay, all that sounds great. I'm interested in filling a skirmisher unit in my army. I can see a few of the aspects already that would make this a positive addition to my army. So what am I looking for in picking out a skirmishing unit? Well, I'm glad you asked because I actually spent the time to go ahead and lay those out. So these are the ideal traits that we're looking for. And now, much like everything else in Age of Sigmar, like whenever you're looking at what army to play or whatever else you might be deciding between, seldom are you going to find all of these traits within one unit. These are just the ideals. We want them to be fast, so they can affect a good range of the battlefield. We want them to have ranged attacks, preferably short to medium range. And now that might seem odd to you because typically longer range is a positive, but in the instance of what we want these troops to be able to do, not having a longer range is actually a benefit, not in the sense that in game there's literally a strength to be had, although there is to a degree, and I'll argue that case further on, to not having a longer range. But the biggest deal is that if you have a unit, again, say something like, the new Stormcast Eternal, I believe Raptors they're called, that have the big either Hurricane crossbows or the Long Strike crossbows. Those are units that have, up to a 30-inch range in the instance of the Long Strikes. And so that's not something that you want to get close to the enemy line. You are incentivized to stay further back. And with these skirmishing units, part of why I say that you only want a short to mid range is you don't want that kind of that psychological benefit, right? To kind of say, maybe I should keep these guys back, because you don't want that with the battle plan I'm going to lay out for you. So having a long range is actually a disadvantage here, and it may again only be because it hinders your ability to properly use them in a skirmishing role. Ideally, a skirmisher will tilt offensively as opposed to defensively. So when you look at their stats, they're going to be putting out more damage. They may not necessarily be as hardy as your main shield wall units. They may not be, a good speed bump in the sense that they can take a hit and really slow down an opponent. They're certainly not what you would consider traditionally to be an anvil in most cases. You are looking more for offense and less for defense here for what they're trying to do. Preferably, they have some kind of hit and fade or hit and run ability, whether it be that they can do something like the Tomb King skeleton horse archers, where they can shoot in the movement phase and move in the shooting phase, or where they can literally do like the Storm Vermin can do and retreat out of combat, or if you give your general for the Soul Blight the Mist Form ability, the ability to fight in combat and then retreat and charge again into another combat. That is an incredibly powerful ability to have in a skirmisher type unit. And finally, they need to be able to, in close combat, outfight their ranged specialist counterparts. Now, by that, I simply mean whenever you look at something like a handgunner unit or a Stormcast Judicator unit, they're not necessarily terrible at melee, but clearly their strengths are in ranged attacks. And for skirmishing units to be truly effective in the battlefield role that we want them to play, they may not be able to go toe-to-toe with a close combat specialist unit, but we want them to be better at close combat than a ranged specialist unit. So in essence, you'll have this bit of rock, paper, scissors going on, where, yes, your shooting units typically beat an opponent's melee unit because they can whittle them down by shooting them, and then your skirmishers will typically trump your ranged specialists, and then your melee units will typically outperform or destroy skirmishing units in a prolonged combat. So you have, in essence, this triangle of power. And now that we've kind of outlined what these particular abilities are that we're looking for, let's consider potential ways that you'll field them on the battlefield. So there are three real potential placements that you would put these skirmishing units compared to the rest of your army based upon what your goal is. You can put them in the lead in kind of a vanguard position. And now the advantages of this are they can soak up enemy fire, so they can play a defensive role and can kind of take some heat off of your main shield wall, your more important, a little bit more sturdy units. They can weaken enemies before your main shield walls clash, and they can be that proverbial speed bump if your opponent has something super fast like a bloodletter bomb that they might hurl across the battlefield. They also have the option of being on either flank. And now this is a safer position for them, and they play more of a support role to the main battle line. So they can use more of their melee attacks, and as there is no, penalty for firing into combat or anything like that, in most instances. There might be something that I'm unaware of in some kind of corner case. But they can sit there and they can pepper enemies much like a ranged specialist unit, and then they can pick their fights and charge in or protect the flanks of your, your more important, your heavier shield wall units that are holding the center of your battle line. And then the third option is, of course, behind your main line in kind of a rear guard position. In this way, they can shoot and pick combat safely while shielded by your heavier shield wall infantry in the front or cavalry. They can literally fire over your friends and into the combat that your friendly main battle line is clashing in. And then at the right time, they can charge up and hit the enemy that your shield wall is clashing with, or again, they can rush around to either flank to protect them. This is the one that the positioning on the battlefield in which they will do the least actual skirmishing in terms of bringing their offensive capability to bear before these shield walls clash, and therefore, it may be a little bit more of a long-term game plan because you're not necessarily getting as quick of results, but this is the positioning that will keep your skirmishing units alive the longest. If they're more of a point sink, or if they are more vital to your particular plan for this battle, then this may be the option you want to take. So now that we've kind of outlined what is a skirmishing unit, what ideally are we looking for, I wanted to give a few examples of some good skirmishing units, at least what I believe to be good skirmishing units, and kind of talk about how you would use them on the battlefield. I have 5 picked out. They're not for every Grand Alliance. I didn't pick out any for destruction, but hopefully, even if you are a destruction player, these examples and my explanation of how I would ideally use them, why I think they're good choices, what their strengths, what their weaknesses are when compared to the ideal skirmishing unit. Hopefully these ideas can at least help carry you as well to picking out your own units to use effectively in that role. So first up, we have for the Stormcast, the Prosecutors. I know for at least my experience, Prosecutors are a unit that seems to be often overlooked, at least locally, by Stormcast players. And in my opinion, that's a real shame because I think that they are perhaps one of the best suited skirmishing units in the game. So quite simply, if we go back to our checklist of abilities that we're looking for on a skirmisher, we're looking for things that are fast, that have ranged attacks that are short to mid-range, that tilt offensively versus defensively, that have some sort of hit and fade ability, and can outfight their ranged specialist counterparts. So with the Prosecutors, they're reasonably cheap enough. They're not too expensive for their unit of 3. Now, I do want to point out that obviously whenever you're comparing them to other units within the Stormcast army, such as the Liberators, you are only getting 3 of these guys for a similar points total, which can be, a bit of a bummer if you're worried about the total number of wounds that your units are taking. But as you know, 5 Liberators is 100, and with these Prosecutors, you're only getting 3 for the same 100 points. So you're looking at a total of 10 wounds for the Liberators versus 6 for the Prosecutors for equal point value. But I believe I can make a case here why it's worth it. So your speed is 12, and that's obviously quite fast. Regular Stormcast move around 5 inches. Now, the big thing is that these Prosecutors can also fly and have a ranged attack range of 18 inches, meaning that their effective range for just their move and shoot in a turn is 30 inches. Obviously, they can charge as well, and they get 3 dice instead of 2 when determining the charge, and they can charge at any enemy unit within 18 inches rather than merely 12. That's really good. You also have options for their weapons. You can pick just the 2 Celestial Hammers. You can give a Grand Axe, a Grand Blade, a Grand Hammer, or Sigmarite Shields. Sigmarite Shields are a decent ability, but I honestly would recommend that you stick either with just the Celestial Hammers or giving one of them, preferably the Prime, a Grand Axe, Grand Blade, or Grand Hammer, depending on who you're going to be going up against in the particular match, or the most likely ones in tournament meta. You'll have to make the decision for yourself. But if you keep the paired Celestial Hammers, the really nice thing is that you're getting to re-roll hit rolls of 1 in close combat and at ranged attacks. So that does buff their ability to hit a little bit. And as you'll see, a lot of these units are not necessarily super hard hitting, so every little bit to help them get more damage in is something worth doing here, because we're not worried about these units surviving in the long term. So whenever you're looking at their ranged attacks, so you're again looking at a roughly 30-inch effective range for this in one turn, between the movement of 12 inches and the shooting of 18. A 4-up followed by a 4-up is only a 25% chance per die roll that you're successfully hitting and then wounding. But you're making 2 attacks, so it's not too bad. And then, of course, you can again charge in, because your charge range is the exact same as your missile range. So you're checking off all these boxes, and it's worth considering bringing these guys. Again, I understand that, you know, if you're worried about wounds and that's how you're purely calculating your army, they're not worth it when compared to your liberators. But the ability of these guys to fly ahead of your main liberator block, or the ability to hop behind an enemy line of units is not to be overstated. The fact that these guys can fly ahead of your main liberator block, and if you're going to fight, for example, Blood Warriors, which are a pretty equal fight, I'd actually give the slight edge to the Blood Warriors because of their special abilities that you can pick in that particular combat. The Prosecutors being able to whittle down a few wounds here and there, maybe kill a model or two with their ranged attacks with the Celestial Hammers, and then again attacking in close combat where there are certainly no slouches, is something well worth considering. Now, understand that if you're doing this kind of skirmishing role with these guys, and you are moving out ahead in a kind of a vanguard position, you are putting these guys in a position to die, and you have to be okay with that. You're only going to want to do something like this in an instance where losing them doesn't matter to the grander scheme of the battlefield. So secondly, we have one that is a personal favorite of mine, and I think that is just so enticing that I almost went out and started a purely mounted Slaves to Darkness army simply because of these guys. And they are the Chaos Marauder horsemen. Now, once again, we see that they are quite fast at a 12-inch movement. They have a short to mid-range missile attack with the Marauder javelins of a 9-inch range. They have a 6-up save, so clearly they're not leaning defensively. Once again, they have similar kinds of stats on their to hit and wounds and total number of attacks and all when compared to the Prosecutors at half the range with the javelins versus the Celestial Hammers. The big deal here is that if you if you have the damned icon, once again, you can reroll hit rolls of 1 on the attack, but the feigned flight is what I really like here that they have over the Prosecutors. This unit can shoot and charge even if it retreated in the same turn. So while the Prosecutors did not have the kind of hit and fade ability, while they still were reasonably cheap, these guys do have that. Now, obviously, the Marauder javelins are not incredible in close combat because, you know, you're looking at a 5-up followed by a 4-up, but you're looking to do more damage, honestly, with the attack at range, and then follow it up with a charge attack, because between 2 attacks with the Chaos Steed's Flailing Hooves at a 4-up, 5-up, and then the 1 attack per model at the 5-up, 4-up, except for the Horsemaster, who's a 4-up followed by a 4-up, and actually a 3-up followed by a 4-up with his ranged attacks. You're just looking to, again, inflict a few points of damage onto your opponent before your main shield walls clash. And again, these are a relatively cheap unit. You're not too terribly worried about them dying, or at least if you're going to use them in this kind of way, you're not too terribly worried about them dying. Your Chaos Marauder horsemen are only 90 points for the 5, which is, again, relatively cheap. In your standard 2,000 point game, you can certainly afford to bring 1 to 2 units of these guys without that being too heavy of a cost to your army. Again, they have other abilities: Darkwood Shields, Horn Blowers, Icon Bearers, things like that. They're nice, that can buff them. And I also want to point out that every single one of these models that I'm going to cover clearly have other synergistic elements that you can bring within their armies that may buff their to hits, their to wounds, give them rerolls, things like that. I'm not worried about covering that here. My whole point here is just to give you ideas on how to use these guys that are typically considered understated in certain ways. I want to show how to use them effectively to kind of boost the effectiveness, if you will, of your more optimal units within your army. So thirdly, we have Skinks, and I have to say I love Skinks. The models are teeny tiny. You can obviously fit quite a large amount of them in a very small space, and they are dirt cheap. For a unit of 10, you pay 60 points per 10. But the big thing is that whenever you bring 30 of them, you're paying 180, and then to bring 10 more is only 20 points. So for the final 10, you get a 40-point discount, which is insane. So the big thing here with Skinks is that, you know, in the Seraphon army, there's obviously a lot of tricks that you can bring. You know, they have all their new commander traits and artifacts and all that honestly cover quite a broad range of options, with the ability for them to take a Slan or a Saurus or a Skink as their commander, and each one of them gains access to different abilities. But the big thing here with the Skinks is that you have two options. I'm actually a little bit more in the favor of the Meteoric Javelin whenever you look at the differences between these two. The Bolt Splitter obviously has double the range of the Meteoric Javelin, but the Javelin has a significantly better to wound. Obviously, at the to wound being a 4-up, meaning 50% of the time, versus the Bolt Splitters 5-up, which is a 33% chance to wound, so significant difference there. But the big deal here that I really like with these guys in a kind of skirmish role is that a large group of these guys can gain +1 to hit if there's at least 20 models, or +2 to hit if there's at least 30 models. So if you're bringing a 30-man unit, which really you should bring 40 because you're only paying 20 points more for that final 10 guys, and you're kind of giving yourself 10 more models of buffer before you get any negatives towards your bonuses to hit before you lose any of them, and you bring the Meteoric Javelins, you're looking at a 3-up, 4-up to hit and wound, which is really, really good. And now this is kind of unique because ordinarily in these kind of skirmishing units, I'm recommending bringing a very small amount, either the minimum or maybe one more iteration on top of that, so you know, twice the minimum. But with the Skinks, because that ability is so good, then it's definitely worth considering running a larger unit. It does kind of take away from the fact that they are fast. Now they're a little bit slower than these other units we've looked at so far at an 8-inch move, but that's still much faster than most infantry. The Star Bucklers are nice because, you know, again, with the other Seraphon units, you have the ability to ignore rend, which is not super valuable considering they're at a 6-up save. So you only have a 1 in 6 chance of ignoring it. But they do kind of have the ability to hit and fade with their wary fighters, when they can, instead of choosing to attack and pile in, they can withdraw instead and move, which is again their regular movement, out of the combat, so they're at least 3 inches away from the enemy. So they are fast. They have a good shooting ability. They have the strength and weakness of being a larger number for a skirmishing unit, but they're still relatively cheap at only 200 points for 40 of them when you're doing that. So they're fulfilling, you know, a lot of those kind of idyllic goals that we have for our skirmish unit, and they have a bit of a hit and fade ability. The one big thing is that they can't really outfight their ranged specialist counterparts that you might be going up against. That's really the one I guess check mark that these guys don't really bring to bear. But again, they can do so many things. They're obviously exceeding the 20 models if you're bringing the 40 for those kind of tiebreaker effects on some scenarios. So they have the ability to, you know, maybe skirmish a little bit and then break off and go for an objective, or, you know, and really bring to bear that tiebreaker effect. So a larger units of Skinks can certainly be an effective, can be more than just an effective skirmishing unit, but they can be good at that as well. And then we have the Free Guild Outriders. And I'm going to recommend that you bring these guys with pistols for this. Now, obviously, the repeater handgun has a significantly better range of 5 more inches, which is a big deal in terms of, like, you're considering that a 14-inch range is further than an enemy's charge can be under ordinary circumstances, while a 9-inch is clearly not. But the big thing is that your to hit and to wound is is one better, and you're not a D3 attack, which yes, D3 on average will be 2, which the brace of pistols automatically is. But at least you're not worried about that off turn whenever you do happen to roll a 1 for the number of attacks that you generate. And then there's the fact that the brace of pistols, while they are the worst to hit, are the best to wound on the melee attack, so it kind of averages out. But they're also the only melee weapon option that has a rend ability. And then, of course, we have the sharpshooter, which gives a bonus to their to hit rolls in the shooting phase. And then, the expert gunner's abilities, which we're not going to really use that much in a kind of skirmishing role, but at least it's an option there if they want to play more of just the harassing element. But again, the big deal here is that these guys are relatively cheap at, I believe, about 130. They're just considerably better than their pistolier counterparts, which cost the same but are actually worse with pistols than these guys are. Just the big deal here is that these guys have the option with their trumpeters. They can shoot and charge even if it ran in the prior movement phase, so it's not quite a hit and fade ability. But again, the big deal with these kind of skirmishing units is that we want a shorter range attack, because we want in these turns to be able to, in essence, reach out and touch the enemy twice. We want to hit them with a short range missile attack, and then we want to hit them again in melee. And you're kind of making up for the fact that your stats are not as good at range or at melee as a specialist in either one of those categories, but because you're able to do both in the same turn and basically get the equivalent of, if you will, of 2 rounds of attacks, that your damage output is going to, in many cases, be still quite significant. And again, you're at a 12-inch move, so you're quite quick. And 2 wounds each is nothing to ignore. And obviously with free people, there's a lot of ways to buff your to hit rolls and all, so you can get these guys extremely accurate. Hitting on 2s is not outlandish at all. So you can do a lot of damage with them, and then let your nice free guild great companies move on in to close combat and just finish off the opponent once you've kind of weakened them and further put the odds in your own favor. And finally, for the final option of these kind of prototypical examples, if you will, of a skirmish unit, we have the Felbats. And I wanted to include these guys for a number of reasons. The first of which being they're for my faction. They're a death unit, but specifically for Soul Blight. And it's really these guys that inspired me to start looking more at the skirmishing aspect within an army and how that would play within Age of Sigmar. In addition, these guys have no ranged attacks, so you might think, wow, they automatically fail in a lot of the aspects of what we're looking for in a skirmishing unit. They can't hit and run as well, so that's another negative. So it's like, how do these guys really fit that role? Well, the Felbats are incredibly fast. They're a 14-inch baseline movement, as you can see here. They have 3 wounds each, which is actually higher than any other unit that we've looked at so far in this video. And then there's the fact that if you take the Swift Death ability, they're actually up to a 16-inch movement, which I will typically be taking. But the big thing here is, if you're playing a Soul Blight army and you're running more of a type of list that I will be running, which is something along the lines of a Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon, maybe 1 to 2 Vampire Lords on horseback, a unit or 2 of Blood Knights, and then the rest of your battle line filled out with Vargeist to save a few points here and there. And then a few units of Felbats, and whether they're 3, 6, or 9 strong, you're typically not going to exceed any of those amounts. Maybe you want to max them out at 12. It's your choice. I wouldn't personally recommend it, just because that's a lot of points at 80 points for 3 each to really throw into a unit that you are in essence throwing away. So obviously, they have roles that they can do, like flying over enemy lines and hitting enemy casters and all, but that's not what we're particularly interested in. The big deal here is that they are prototypical in the skirmishing aspect because of their scent of gore and how they're going to play within your army. So Soul Blight is an elite army. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, that elite versus horde is one thing that we consider a lot, especially within the new meta. and we kind of think to ourselves as elite army players, well, how am I going to get around facing enemy horde units? Yes, my Blood Knights are superior in terms of a model by model basis. Yes, they're going to be able to theoretically, unless the dice abandon you, kill a large amount of units with, excuse me, a large amount of models within that more horde unit. But the problem is that within these scenarios, most of these games are only 5 turns, maybe 6 turns long. So you don't have a lot of time to really wade through those units. So something fast, even faster than your Blood Knights, and even faster than your Vargeists, is necessary to kind of help them along. And that's where these Felbats in a kind of skirmishing role come in. So what you're going to want to do with these Felbats is, in essence, escort your more elite units to the front line. You're going to fly them as fast as you can in a kamikaze suicide assault. You're going to charge them into an enemy unit, hopefully via some spell or some ranged attack from maybe your Vampire Lord Zombie Dragon or an allied unit that you've brought in, maybe like a Terrorgeist Screaming, that they're going to have been within 6 inches of an enemy model that was slain before you actually begin combat. If not, it's okay. Your first round of combat will just be half as effective as it could be. So try to time that together if you can. It's very important to maximize the effectiveness of these guys on the battlefield against a larger horde-based army. So what you're going to do is obviously fly these guys in, as I said, like a bat bomb. Hopefully it's 6 attacks, each at a 4-up, 4-up. So with only 3 of them, you're generating 18 attacks. Obviously, at 6, that's doubled, and with 9, it's been tripled. So they can generate an impressive number of attacks for a small amount of models. They obviously have no rend. Their hit and the wounds are not great, but there are a plethora of spells and abilities within death that you can cast, even within the Soulblight army, to either buff all of them by +1 attack, to give them rerolls. There's ways to buff their combat effectiveness to make them more likely to hit and to kill than a 4-up by 4-up would necessarily ordinarily indicate. But the big thing here is that you're charging them into these horde units, and you're softening up those horde units before your elite things hit them. And now whether or not that's in the same turn, maybe you've hit them for 1 turn and then they're still in combat and then your heavier stuff comes charging in, or not, is ultimately irrelevant, because the point is you want to get those attacks in fast, weaken those horde units as quickly as you can so that your big heavy stuff, your elite stuff, can come in, and between the impressive damage output that they can put out and your opponent losing so many models that they fail battle shock tests, that's what you have to do to win these scenarios that are based upon model count. For any kind of tie-breaking purposes, you've got a battle shock and hit hard and fast lightning blitzkrieg type damage to just blow them off the battlefield as fast as possible. Because honestly, in most instances against a horde-based army, simple mathematics is going to show that you cannot win the prolonged fight, regardless of how sturdy your troops are. Enough dice rolls and enough attacks getting through, you'll eventually fail your 3-up or 4-up armor saves, regardless of whether or not they have rend. So the Felbats help to kind of throw the odds a little bit more in your favor prior to the battle lines actually engaging in combat. And that's the big point here that I've said it before, I'm going to reiterate again before we close out this video, is that the role of these skirmishing units primarily is to throw the battle a little bit more in your favor. Most of the time, I would be recommending that you're bringing these guys in small enough squads to where if you lose them, it doesn't really matter that much. Points value wise, you didn't invest too much in them. It's not going to hurt you in the long run. And that's what we're looking for here. Now, again, skirmishing units, because of their strengths and weaknesses that we've already outlined that we're ideally looking for, they have other roles that they can fulfill on the battlefield, which is important. A lot of these units, like I pointed out earlier, are not the most optimal in terms of their stats on inflicting damage or being able to withstand enemies' damage inflicted upon them. Maybe they don't have a whole lot of special abilities that are particularly optimal whenever you look at the entire army in terms of speed or movement shenanigans or whatever else. But the point here being that most of these units have some kind of ability to hit in the shooting phase, and then they're still close enough whenever that triggers that they can then charge and hit again in the melee phase, or they have some kind of other buff that strengthens one of those 2 aspects. They lean offensively. because their goal is to hit, inflict damage, and make life a little bit easier for your more important, typically to your battle plan, main shield wall, hammer, or anvil units. So with that being said, I hope that I've given you some insight into maybe these underappreciated units, how to use them effectively on the battlefield, and how to help you be successful in claiming victory within your games of Age of Sigmar. Because within these new match play scenarios, speed is everything, and that double down in one turn ability that many skirmishing units can do is something well worth considering in terms of inflicting and projecting power as quickly as possible across the battlefield. So until next time, this is James, and happy gaming.